Christmas Eve, 1828. Los Angeles. A city draped in candlelight and prayer. But beneath the hymns and holy processions, something ancient was stirring. They called him Father Geronimo, a Franciscan friar beloved by thousands. A man who carried the cross through the streets with tears streaming down his face. Women kissed his robes. Children reached for his blessing. The governor himself knelt before this living saint. But here's what they didn't tell you in the history books. Here's what was buried in sealed church archives for nearly 2 centuries. Father Geronimo wasn't a saint. He was something far more calculated, far more dangerous. And on that Christmas Eve, beneath the bells of La Iglesia de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Angeles, he would perform an act so profane, so perfectly orchestrated, that it would reshape the psychological landscape of an entire region for generations. This isn't a ghost story. This is a case study in mass manipulation, in weaponized faith, in how one man turned devotion into chains. And if you think this couldn't happen today, you're already under someone else's control. Let me show you how deep this goes. You need to understand something about early California. This wasn't the golden frontier myth you were fed in school. This was a theocratic experiment. The Spanish missions weren't just churches. They were psychological fortresses designed to break the indigenous mind and reconstruct it in the image of colonial power. The Franciscans who ran these missions understood something most men today have forgotten. Control the spirit, control everything. Father Geronimo arrived in 1819, 9 years before our story. Nobody knew where he came from. His records were vague, incomplete. Some said he was from Salamanca. Others whispered he'd been expelled from a monastery in New Spain for practices too dark to name. But he had something the other friars didn't. Charisma that felt supernatural. A voice that could crack stone. Eyes that seemed to see through flesh into the guilt you carried. Within months, he transformed the Los Angeles Pueblo from a dusty outpost into a pilgrimage site. People traveled weeks to hear him preach, to confess their sins to him, to receive his touch. But here's where it gets disturbing. Father Geronimo didn't just preach salvation. He preached dependency. Every sermon was a psychological operation. He'd start with love and mercy, drawing people in with warmth and acceptance. Then, slowly, methodically, he'd introduce shame. Deep, cellular shame about being human. About having desires. About existing outside his approval. He created what modern psychologists would call a trauma bond. You're broken, he'd whisper during confession. Only through me can you be whole. Only my intercession stands between you and eternal fire. Women began reporting dreams of him. Nightmares where he appeared with bleeding hands, accusing them of secret sins they'd never committed. Men found themselves unable to make decisions without seeking his counsel first. Children stopped playing, instead spending hours in silent prayer, terrified of disappointing Father Geronimo. The Pueblo was becoming a cult. And the church hierarchy? They celebrated it. Because devotion, no matter how twisted, filled the coffers and strengthened Spanish control over the territory. Now let's talk about what was happening behind the altar. In the mission archives there are records. Fragmentary. Disturbing. Accounts of special confessions that lasted hours. Of women entering Father Geronimo's chambers and emerging changed. Hollow-eyed. Speaking in whispers about penance that left marks they couldn't explain to their husbands. Indigenous converts spoke of ceremonies conducted in the catacombs beneath the church. Rituals that mixed Catholic liturgy with something older. Something that predated Christ by millennia. Father Geronimo was practicing what the church would later call extreme spiritual discipline. But documents suggest something darker. He was experimenting with psychological breaking points, testing how far he could push human consciousness before it shattered and could be rebuilt in his image. He kept journals, detailed observations of behavioral changes, how long it took to break someone's will, which combination of fasting, sleep deprivation, and induced guilt produced the most obedient followers. This wasn't faith. This was research. Human research. And Christmas Eve 1828 was his grand experiment. 3 weeks before Christmas, Father Geronimo announced a revelation. He'd been visited by the Virgin Mary herself. She'd shown him a vision of Los Angeles consumed by fire. Punishment for hidden sins. 4 secret wickedness festering in the hearts of the faithful. The only way to avert this apocalypse? A mass confession. Every man, woman, and child in the Pueblo would need to confess their darkest secrets publicly on Christmas Eve. In front of the entire community. Under the eyes of God and Father Geronimo. Panic spread like plague. People began confessing to crimes they hadn't committed, terrified that some hidden sin might doom their families. Neighbors turned on neighbors, accusing each other of moral failings to prove their own purity. The social fabric of Los Angeles was tearing apart. And Father Geronimo watched it all with something that witnesses described as terrible satisfaction. He was dismantling the old order, preparing the ground for something new, something he alone would control. The governor tried to intervene. He was denounced from the pulpit as an agent of Satan. Here's where you need to pay attention. Because what Father Geronimo was doing wasn't unique to 1828. It's the same playbook used by every authoritarian system throughout history. First, create an existential threat. Something so terrifying that people will surrender anything for protection. Then, position yourself as the only barrier between them and annihilation. Finally, demand increasingly extreme acts of loyalty to prove devotion. It's the formula for manufacturing compliance. The Inquisition used it. The Nazis used it. Modern intelligence agencies use it. Corporate cultures use it. Social media platforms use it. Father Geronimo just had a crucifix instead of an algorithm. By Christmas Eve, the Pueblo was a powder keg. Families were divided. Former friends refused to speak. Everyone was watching everyone, searching for signs of hidden sin. And through it all, Father Geronimo moved like a spider in the center of a web, pulling strings, whispering suggestions, shaping the chaos he'd created into a weapon. That night, as bells rang across the city, over 3,000 people gathered in the plaza outside the church. The scene was biblical. Torches burning. Incense thick in the air. Father Geronimo stood on a raised platform, backlit by the church doors, arms spread like he was nailed to an invisible cross. For an hour, people confessed. Adultery. Theft. Thoughts of violence. Doubts about God. Each confession was met with Father Geronimo's judgment. Some were forgiven with a touch. Others were commanded to perform public penance, whipping themselves until they bled. The crowd was hypnotized, caught in a collective trance of fear and ecstasy. Then Father Geronimo called forward a young woman named Maria Elena Cortez. She was 17, daughter of a prominent ranchero. By all accounts, innocent, devout. She approached trembling, and before she could speak, Father Geronimo pointed at her and screamed, "This one carries the mark of the adversary. This one has lain with demons. This one must be purified or we all burn." The crowd turned on her instantly. The psychological conditioning was complete. They saw what Father Geronimo told them to see. A scapegoat. A sacrifice. What happened next is documented in multiple sources. Church records. Witness testimonies. Letters from survivors. Maria Elena was dragged to the center of the plaza. Father Geronimo commanded the crowd to confess on her behalf. To speak aloud the sins she was too corrupted to admit. And they did. They invented elaborate fantasies of depravity. Incest. Witchcraft. Pacts with the devil. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter. This was about power. About demonstrating total control over reality itself. Father Geronimo could make 3,000 people believe anything. Could make them see evil where there was only innocence. That's not religious fervor. That's mind control at a mass scale. Maria Elena was stripped and bound to a post. Father Geronimo himself took up a whip. For 20 minutes, he beat her while the crowd chanted prayers. Her screams were drowned out by hymns. When she finally lost consciousness, Father Geronimo declared her purified. The city was saved. The Virgin's prophecy was fulfilled. The crowd exploded in ecstatic celebration. They'd witnessed a miracle. They'd participated in salvation. But here's what really happened. Here's what the church tried to erase. Maria Elena Cortez had done something unforgivable. She'd refused Father Geronimo's advances. 3 weeks earlier, during confession, he'd propositioned her. Told her that physical union with him was a form of prayer. A way to experience divine love. She'd fled his chambers and told her father. Her father, Don Alejandro Cortez, had gone to the church authorities. Had demanded an investigation. Father Geronimo's response was surgical. He destroyed her. Turned her into a public example of what happened to those who challenged his authority. And he did it by manipulating the entire Pueblo into becoming his accomplices. Every person who chanted, who threw stones, who watched in approving silence, they all became invested in the lie. Because admitting Maria Elena was innocent meant admitting their own complicity in torture. Cognitive dissonance made them double down. Made them defend the narrative. This is how institutional evil sustains itself. Not through individual monsters, but through distributed guilt that locks everyone into defending the indefensible. Maria Elena survived. Barely. Her family smuggled her out that night, took her north to Mexican territory. But she was destroyed. The historical record shows she spent the rest of her short life in a convent, broken in mind and spirit. She died at 23. Meanwhile, Father Geronimo's power only grew. The Christmas Eve purification became an annual event. Each year, a new scapegoat, a new lesson in obedience. The Pueblo lived in perpetual fear of being chosen, of being sacrificed to maintain the collective illusion of purity. This went on for 7 more years. 7 years of psychological terrorism dressed in holy robes. And here's the part that should terrify you. Nobody stopped him. The church hierarchy knew. Documents prove they knew. But Father Geronimo was effective. He kept the indigenous population controlled. He generated massive revenue through tithes and donations. He maintained Spanish authority in a region where it was weakening. So they let him continue. They let him destroy lives because he was useful. Because power protects power. Because institutions care more about their own survival than about truth or justice or the individuals they crush. In 1835, everything changed. But not because of justice. Not because anyone suddenly grew a conscience. Father Geronimo made a mistake. He chose the wrong victim. Diego Sepulveda, son of a wealthy Spanish merchant with connections to the colonial government in Mexico City. Diego had been questioning Father Geronimo's teachings, speaking quietly with other young men about the friar's methods. On Christmas Eve 1835, Father Geronimo called Diego forward for purification. But Diego refused. In front of 3,000 people, he looked Father Geronimo in the eyes and said no. The plaza went silent. In that moment, the spell cracked. Because someone had demonstrated that Father Geronimo was just a man. That his power only existed because people chose to give it to him. Diego didn't attack. Didn't argue. He just turned and walked away. And 20, 30, then 100 people followed him. The mass illusion collapsed. Father Geronimo screamed for them to stop. Threatened eternal damnation. But the psychological grip had broken. They'd seen behind the curtain. Within a week, testimonies started flooding in. Women came forward. Indigenous converts spoke about the underground rituals. Families of previous scapegoats demanded investigations. The church tried to contain it. Tried to frame it as apostasy, as rebellion against God himself. But too many people had woken up. The governor, who'd been humiliated years earlier, seized the opportunity. He ordered Father Geronimo's arrest. When soldiers came to the mission, they found his chambers filled with journals. Hundreds of pages documenting his experiments in psychological control. Sketches of the human mind as a fortress to be conquered. Detailed notes on breaking techniques borrowed from Inquisition manuals. Lists of community members ranked by their susceptibility to manipulation. Evidence of systematic abuse going back to his arrival in 1819. This wasn't a fallen priest. This was a predator who'd weaponized faith. Who'd turned religion into a technology of control. The church immediately moved to suppress everything. The journals were sealed. The investigation was transferred to ecclesiastical courts. Father Geronimo was quietly shipped back to Spain. He was never punished. Here's where the story gets buried. The official church records from this period are sparse. Deliberately vague. They describe Father Geronimo as a troubled soul who lost his way. A footnote in California mission history. But in private correspondence between church officials, a different picture emerges. They weren't horrified by what he'd done. They were impressed. Multiple letters discuss his innovative methods of ensuring devotion. His remarkable ability to maintain order. There's even discussion of applying his techniques more broadly across the mission system. They didn't see a monster. They saw a pioneer. Someone who'd proven that human consciousness was far more malleable than they'd previously understood. That with the right combination of fear, shame, and spiritual authority, you could make people believe anything. Do anything. Betray their own perception of reality. Father Geronimo's real crime wasn't the abuse. It was getting caught. And even that didn't stop his legacy. His methods were quietly adopted, refined, incorporated into the standard operating procedures of religious institutions, and eventually secular ones too. Now, I want you to do something. Stop and think about the systems you're part of right now. Your workplace, your social circles, your political tribe, the platforms you use every day. How many of them operate on Father Geronimo's playbook? Create existential fear. Position themselves as the only solution. Demand increasingly extreme demonstrations of loyalty. Punish dissent not with arguments but with social destruction. Turn you into a participant in your own manipulation so you're invested in defending it. Make you police others to prove your own purity. The tactics haven't changed. They've just been scaled. What Father Geronimo did to 3,000 people with sermons and confessions, modern systems do to billions with algorithms and social pressure. The mechanism is identical. Exploit the human need for belonging, for meaning, for protection from chaos. Then gradually reshape reality itself until people can't distinguish between genuine belief and induced compliance. And if you think you're immune, if you think you'd be the one who walked away like Diego Sepulveda, you're already caught. Because that's what everyone thinks. That's what every person in that plaza thought until the moment they found themselves chanting for blood. Let me tell you what happened to the Pueblo after Father Geronimo left. You'd think there would be healing, reconciliation, a return to normalcy. Instead, it fractured permanently. The people who'd participated most enthusiastically in the Christmas Eve rituals couldn't face what they'd done. So they constructed elaborate justifications. Insisted that the victims really had been corrupted. That Father Geronimo had been flawed but fundamentally right. They formed their own faction, continuing his teachings in secret. The survivors and those who'd walked away formed another group. They demanded accountability. Wanted the church to admit what had happened. The church refused. Offered neither apology nor acknowledgement. Just silence and the slow, grinding pressure of institutional indifference. Families were divided for generations. Brothers who'd stood on opposite sides of that plaza never spoke again. The psychological wounds didn't heal. They calcified into identity, into inherited trauma that shaped how their children and grandchildren viewed authority, faith, community. One event, one man, reverberating through time like a stone dropped in still water. Circles expanding outward, touching lives that never knew the origin of their pain. This is what's missing from most discussions of manipulation and control. The aftermath. The cost extracted long after the manipulator is gone. Father Geronimo lived comfortably in Spain until his death in 1851. He never expressed remorse. His victims and their families lived with the consequences forever. That's the asymmetry of psychological warfare. The perpetrator moves on. The victims carry it like a virus in their nervous system, passing it to everyone they touch. Studies of mass manipulation events, cults, genocides, totalitarian regimes, show this pattern consistently. The primary damage isn't what happens during the event. It's the shattering of the victim's ability to trust their own perception, to trust others, to believe in the possibility of genuine goodness. Once you've been made to participate in something evil while believing it was righteous, you lose faith in your own moral compass. You become easy to control again because you no longer trust yourself to resist. That's why these systems are so effective. They don't just control behavior. They control the very mechanism people use to evaluate whether they're being controlled. Now let me show you something that's going to disturb you. Father Geronimo's techniques are taught today. Not under his name, obviously. But the core principles are foundational to modern persuasion technology, corporate culture design, and social engineering. Create dependency by first solving a problem you secretly created. Use shame and fear to bypass rational evaluation. Make compliance feel like personal choice through illusion of voluntary participation. Isolate people from alternative perspectives. Control the language used to describe reality. Punish dissent through social rejection rather than direct coercion. All of this is standard practice in marketing, management consulting, political campaigning, and social media platform design. The people implementing these techniques aren't evil. They're professionals doing their jobs using best practices. That's the genius of the system Father Geronimo helped pioneer. It's not a conspiracy. It's an emergent property of any organization that prioritizes control and profit over human well-being. The techniques spread because they work, because they're effective at shaping behavior. And the ethical implications are irrelevant because they've been sanitized, rebranded, stripped of religious context and dressed in the language of growth hacking and user engagement. There's a document. I'm not going to tell you how I found it because that would compromise the source. But it's a training manual from a modern consumer psychology firm. One of the big ones that advises Fortune 500 companies. There's a section on creating emotional dependency to brand identity. The methodology is point-by-point identical to Father Geronimo's confession techniques. Identify the customer's deepest insecurities. Position your product as the only real solution. Create rituals of engagement that feel meaningful. Establish in-group and out-group dynamics. Make purchasing decisions feel like moral choices. They don't reference Father Geronimo. They probably don't know who he was. But they've independently discovered the same principles because they're fundamental to how human psychology can be exploited. This isn't paranoia. This is documented reality. The same techniques used to make Maria Elena Cortez's neighbors destroy her are used to make you feel incomplete without the latest iPhone. To make you defend political positions you adopted from a YouTube algorithm. To make you attack strangers online for violating norms you didn't consciously choose. The scale is different. The method is the same. I need you to comment something right now. Type this exactly, I see the pattern. Do it twice. Once in the comments and once in your mind. This isn't superstition. It's neurological anchoring. When you actively participate, even in something as small as commenting, you shift from passive consumption to active integration. The knowledge moves from abstract information to lived awareness. The phrase itself is a key. I see the pattern is an acknowledgement that breaks the spell of invisibility that protects these systems. Every authority that's ever manipulated masses has relied on one thing: people not recognizing the pattern, not seeing how the same techniques repeat across different contexts. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you say it, you can't pretend ignorance. So do it now. I see the pattern. Because we're about to go deeper, and what comes next requires you to be locked in. To be the kind of man who doesn't look away when uncomfortable truths appear. Comment it now. Then keep going. Good. Now that you're locked in, let's talk about what Father Geronimo really understood. Something most people never grasp. Human beings don't operate on logic. They operate on narrative. We're story-making machines. We take disconnected events and weave them into coherent tales that explain our place in the universe. Whoever controls the narrative controls reality itself. Father Geronimo didn't just tell stories. He made people characters in his story. In his narrative, they were fallen souls in constant danger, and he was the shepherd guiding them to salvation. Every action he demanded made sense within that story. The beatings, the confessions, the scapegoating. All of it was justified by the overarching narrative of spiritual warfare. This is why facts don't change minds. Why you can show someone evidence that contradicts their beliefs and they'll dismiss it instantly. Because facts are meaningless outside a narrative framework. If the story says Father Geronimo is a saint, then evidence of his abuse must be lies. Must be tests of faith. Must be attacks from the devil. The narrative has antibodies that protect it from reality. Modern power structures have perfected this. They don't censor information anymore. That's crude and creates martyrs. Instead, they flood the zone with competing narratives. Make everything a story. Make every story questionable. Until people give up trying to figure out what's true and just choose the narrative that feels best. That's what makes them comfortable. That confirms their existing identity. Father Geronimo had to carefully construct his narrative over years. Modern systems generate thousands of narratives per second through social media, news cycles, entertainment, and advertising. Your attention is a battleground. Every platform, every ideology, every brand is trying to make you a character in their story. And here's the key: they're not trying to control what you think. They're trying to control how you think. To train you to evaluate information based on whether it fits the narrative rather than whether it's true. Once you're thinking in their framework, they don't need to censor you. You'll censor yourself. You'll attack anyone who challenges the story because they're attacking your identity. You become an immune system cell protecting the narrative that's infected you. Let me give you a concrete example. After the 2008 financial crisis, there were two dominant narratives. One blamed greedy bankers and deregulation. The other blamed government interference and entitlement programs. Both narratives had evidence. Both had passionate believers. But here's what neither narrative acknowledged. The system itself is designed to periodically destroy wealth and transfer it upward. Boom and bust cycles aren't failures of the system. They're features. But that reality doesn't fit either mainstream narrative. So it's invisible. People can argue endlessly about regulation versus free markets, and they're both missing the actual mechanism of extraction. That's narrative control at its finest. Give people two options to fight over, both of which avoid the real issue. Make them so invested in their side that suggesting a third option marks you as crazy, or dangerous, or naive. Father Geronimo did the same thing. He created two acceptable positions: devout believer or corrupted sinner. There was no third option. No, maybe this friar is manipulating us. That thought was literally unthinkable within the narrative framework he'd constructed. Modern systems just scaled this up. Now here's a question that should haunt you. How much of what you believe right now is actually yours? How much did you consciously choose versus absorb from the narrative environments you're embedded in? Your political views, your lifestyle preferences, your definitions of success and failure, your understanding of history, your concept of what it means to be a man. Did you examine these critically, or did they just feel true because everyone around you agreed? Because the platforms you use reinforced them? Because disagreeing would mean social isolation? This isn't an attack. It's an invitation to audit yourself. Father Geronimo's victims didn't think they were brainwashed. They thought they were devout, righteous, making their own choices. The people who destroyed Maria Elena Cortez thought they were serving God, protecting their community. They felt certain. That certainty is the enemy. The moment you're absolutely sure you're right, you should be terrified. Because certainty is the feeling of successful conditioning, of having fully internalized someone else's narrative. Doubt is uncomfortable. But it's also the only defense against manipulation. Healthy skepticism, constant questioning, willingness to update beliefs when evidence changes. That's freedom. Let's return to Father Geronimo one more time, because there's a final layer to this story that most people miss. After his removal, researchers eventually got access to some of his journals. What they found was disturbing beyond the techniques themselves. Father Geronimo had documented his own psychological state, his descent into the monster he became. And it started with conviction. Absolute certainty that he was right. He arrived in Los Angeles genuinely believing he was saving souls. That the indigenous people and Mexican settlers needed his guidance. That harsh methods were justified by the eternal stakes. But over time the power changed him. The more control he gained, the more he needed. The more people obeyed, the more their obedience felt like proof of his rightness. He became addicted to the feeling of bending reality to his will. By the end, his journals barely mention God. They're obsessed with control for its own sake, with the pleasure of making people do things that violated their nature. He'd become the very evil he claimed to fight against. And he couldn't see it, because the narrative in his own mind protected him from recognizing what he'd become. This is the warning embedded in Father Geronimo's story. The path from good intentions to monstrous actions is paved with certainty and unchecked power. He didn't wake up one day and decide to be evil. He slowly justified each escalation. Each abuse was necessary. Each victim deserved it. Each expansion of control was for the greater good. The people who implement the modern versions of his techniques aren't cackling villains either. They're optimizing user engagement, growing market share, winning elections, maintaining social order. They tell themselves stories where they're the heroes, where the manipulation is necessary, where the ends justify the means. And maybe they start with good intentions too. Maybe they genuinely want to help people make better choices, build better lives, create better societies. But the mechanism corrupts. Power concentrates. Feedback loops emerge. And before anyone realizes what's happening, the system is optimizing for control rather than the original stated goal. This has happened in every institution throughout history. Religious, political, corporate, educational. The pattern is invariable. And most people never see it because they're characters in the story, not readers of it. So what do you do with this information? How do you live in a world where narrative manipulation is the water you swim in? First, understand that you can't escape it entirely. You're a social being. You need stories. You need community. You need to believe in things larger than yourself. The goal isn't to become a paranoid hermit who trusts nothing. That's just another form of capture. The goal is to develop what I call narrative fluidity. The ability to hold beliefs provisionally, to shift between different story frameworks and see how each one illuminates different aspects of reality, to recognize that all narratives are maps, not territories, useful fictions that highlight certain features while obscuring others. When you're locked into one narrative, one way of seeing, you're vulnerable. You're Maria Elena's neighbors, seeing evil because Father Geronimo pointed and said to see evil. But when you can consciously shift between narratives, you start to see the puppet strings. You notice when you're being positioned as a character, when your emotions are being manipulated, when you're being offered false choices. You don't need to reject all narratives. You need to own your relationship to them. Second, audit your certainties regularly. Make a list of things you're absolutely sure about. Political beliefs, historical facts, personal judgments. Then deliberately seek out the strongest version of the opposing view. Not strawman arguments. Not the dumbest person who disagrees with you. The smartest, most articulate challenge to your certainty. You don't have to agree, but you have to understand why intelligent people might see it differently. This practice does something crucial. It breaks the emotional fusion between your beliefs and your identity. You start to hold ideas instead of being held by them. Father Geronimo's followers couldn't do this. Their faith and their identity were fused. Questioning one meant destroying the other. So they couldn't question. Modern polarization is the same mechanism. People's politics, their brand loyalties, their social media tribes, these have fused with identity. Disagreement feels like attack, like existential threat. That's not accident. That's design. Systems benefit from you being locked in, unable to shift, unable to see from other angles. They want you certain. They want you fused, because then you're controllable. Third, recognize the signs of manipulation in real time. There are tells. Emotional escalation that bypasses rational thought. Us versus them framing. Demands for immediate action before you can think. Appeals to fear and disgust. Claims that questioning is dangerous. Promises of simple solutions to complex problems. Charismatic individuals who position themselves as indispensable. When you see these patterns, slow down. Pull back. Ask questions. Who benefits if I believe this? What alternative explanations exist? What am I being asked to do and why the urgency? What information am I not being shown? These questions are antibodies. They protect you from narrative infection. But here's the hard part. You'll need to ask them about things you want to believe, about causes you support, about leaders you admire, about communities you belong to, because manipulation isn't just something they do to you. It's something we do to each other, something you might be doing to yourself. The narratives you're most loyal to are the ones you've least examined. That's where the real work is. Let me tell you what happened to Diego Sepulveda, the young man who walked away, who broke the spell. He's almost completely absent from the historical record. A footnote in a few documents. Nothing compared to the pages devoted to Father Geronimo. What? Because the system doesn't want you to know about the people who walk away. It wants you to know about the powerful manipulators and their victims. Because both of those roles keep you engaged with the system. The manipulator is the villain you fight. The victim is the role you fear. But the person who just walks away, who recognizes the game and refuses to play, that's the truly dangerous example. That shows there's an exit. That you can opt out. That power only exists when you give it. Diego disappeared from history because he represented the one thing institutions can't tolerate. Indifference. Not rebellion. Not reform. Just the quiet recognition that the whole thing is illegitimate and choosing to build something else. The system can fight rebels. Can co-opt reformers. But it can't engage with people who simply stop participating. Who walk away and build alternatives. This is your real power. Not fighting. Not fixing. Not exposing. Those are all forms of engagement that keep you locked in. Your power is in where you place your attention, your energy, your belief. Every minute you spend arguing within someone else's narrative framework is a minute you're not building your own. Every ounce of emotional energy you pour into outrage at the latest manipulation is energy you're not investing in sovereignty. The system wants your engagement. Anger, fear, hope, outrage, it doesn't matter. All emotional investment strengthens the narrative. All attention feeds the beast. That's why modern content is optimized for engagement, not truth. For viral sharing, not insight. For keeping you scrolling, clicking, reacting. Your attention is the resource being extracted. Your emotional response is the product being sold. And you're volunteering it every single day. Father Geronimo needed to physically gather people in a plaza. Modern systems have you gathered in your pocket, offering up your consciousness 24/7. The scope is different. The mechanism is identical. And the escape is the same. Recognize the game and stop playing it. Build your own game instead. So let's talk about building alternatives. Because walking away isn't enough if you don't walk towards something. Diego Sepulveda didn't just leave Father Geronimo's plaza. He built a different kind of community. One based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical control. On questioning rather than blind faith. On horizontal relationships rather than vertical submission. It didn't last long. The historical record suggests it fell apart within a few years. Because building is harder than destroying. Creating healthy systems is harder than escaping toxic ones. But the attempt matters. The example matters. Every alternative you build, no matter how small, no matter how imperfect, is a proof of concept. Is evidence that other ways are possible. Start small. Start local. Start with your own mind. Reclaim your attention from algorithmic control. Choose what you focus on rather than letting platforms choose for you. Build relationships based on truth rather than shared narratives. Create value instead of just consuming content. Develop skills that make you useful independent of institutional approval. These aren't revolutionary acts. They're the foundation of sovereignty. Of being a man who owns his own consciousness instead of renting it out to the highest bidder. Now I'm going to tell you something that might make you uncomfortable. You are both victim and perpetrator in this system. You've been manipulated, yes. But you've also manipulated others. You've shared content designed to trigger outrage because it felt good to be on the right side. You've dismissed people who disagreed with you because your narrative said they were stupid or evil. You've participated in mob dynamics online and in person. You've enforced social norms through judgment and exclusion without examining whether those norms serve anyone's actual well-being. You've been Father Geronimo's congregation. And at times, you've been Father Geronimo himself, using whatever power you have to make others conform to your vision of how things should be. This isn't an accusation. It's an invitation to integration, to recognize that the capacity for this lives in you. That given the right circumstances, the right pressures, the right narratives, you could do what Father Geronimo did. Maybe not at his scale. But the mechanism is in all of us. The desire to control, to be certain, to make others see what we see, to punish deviation. Acknowledging this is crucial, because you can't resist what you don't recognize in yourself. The people most susceptible to manipulation are those who think they're immune, who believe they're too smart, too skeptical, too aware to be controlled. That arrogance is the opening, the crack in the armor. Father Geronimo's most devoted followers weren't the simple faithful. They were the educated, the influential, the people who prided themselves on their discernment. They were convinced of their own immunity right up until they were beating an innocent girl and calling it holy. Humility is the ultimate defense. Not weakness, not uncertainty about your values, but the recognition that you're a human being with the same cognitive vulnerabilities as everyone else. That your perception is limited, your reasoning is flawed, your emotions can be hijacked, your identity can be weaponized against you. When you know this, really know it in your bones, you become harder to manipulate. Because manipulators rely on your blind spots, on the assumptions you don't examine, on the certainties you don't question. Humility lights up those blind spots, makes you check your reasoning, question your reactions, consider alternative explanations. It's not comfortable, but it's free. Let me give you a framework for evaluating whether you're being manipulated or making free choices. Ask yourself, is this decision being made from expansion or contraction? Expansion means moving towards something. Growth, curiosity, building, creating, connecting. Feels like opening, like possibility. Contraction means moving away from something. Fear, avoidance, defense, destruction. Feels like closing, like narrowing. Manipulation always works through contraction. Makes you afraid, makes you defend, makes you attack to prevent attack, makes you close down and look for threats. Even when it's dressed up as positive, as joining a movement or fighting for good, if the core motivation is fear of what happens if you don't, that's contraction. That's manipulation. Free choice comes from expansion. From genuine curiosity about what might be possible. From values you've examined and chosen. From connection to something larger than fear. This doesn't mean expansion is always right and contraction is always wrong. Sometimes fear is appropriate. Sometimes defense is necessary. But as a decision-making framework, this question cuts through a lot of bullshit. It reveals motivation. And motivation reveals whose agenda you're really serving. Father Geronimo's legacy didn't end with his exile. The techniques he refined, the psychological principles he exploited, they spread. Not through direct lineage but through convergent evolution. Different people in different contexts discovering the same vulnerabilities in human consciousness. The same levers of control. By the mid-1800s, these methods were being used by evangelical preachers across America. By political machines in growing cities. By advertisers selling everything from soap to salvation. By the early 1900s, they were being systematized, studied scientifically, applied at industrial scale. The field of public relations was born. Propaganda became a science. Mass media became a tool for shaping consciousness. And the same basic playbook, create fear, offer protection, demand compliance, was refined and optimized. We live in the end state of that evolution, where every platform, every institution, every authority figure has access to psychological manipulation techniques that would make Father Geronimo weep with envy. Where your own devices track your emotional states and optimize content to keep you engaged. Where political campaigns use psychological profiling to craft messages that bypass your rational mind. Where corporations shape your desires before you're conscious of having them. The scale is incomprehensible, but the pattern is the same. So here's the final question. What do you do now? Now that you see the pattern. Now that you understand how deep this goes. Now that you recognize your own complicity and vulnerability. You have three options. First, you can reject it all. Become bitter, cynical, withdraw from society and trust nothing. That's understandable. But it's also another form of capture. Cynicism is just inverted faith. It's still letting the system define your relationship to reality. Second, you can fight it. Become an activist. Try to reform institutions. Expose manipulation. Protect others. That's noble. But fighting systems from within their framework is like trying to drain the ocean with a bucket. You'll exhaust yourself and the system will adapt around you. Or third, you can become sovereign. Develop your own center, your own discernment, your own capacity to navigate narrative environments without being captured by them. And from that sovereignty, build alternatives. Create spaces where different principles operate, where consciousness is respected rather than exploited, where power serves life rather than concentrating for its own sake. This is the hardest path. It requires constant vigilance, constant growth, constant willingness to question yourself. But it's the only path that actually leads somewhere other than where the system wants you to go. Sovereignty doesn't mean isolation. It means knowing where you end and the narrative begins. It means being able to participate in systems without being owned by them, to engage with ideas without being infected by them, to connect with communities without losing yourself in them. Diego Sepulveda had this quality. The historical fragments suggest he maintained relationships across the divide that split Los Angeles. He didn't become bitter toward those who'd stayed with Father Geronimo, didn't need to prove them wrong or himself right. He just lived differently, built differently. And some of those people, over time, found their way to him. Not because he convinced them, but because example is the only argument that works against narrative capture. You can't logic someone out of a position they didn't logic themselves into. You can't fact-check faith, but you can demonstrate an alternative, can show that another way of being is possible. And for people who are ready, who have cracks forming in their own certainty, that example is a lifeline. That's how real change happens. Not through revolution or reform. Through quiet defection. Through people choosing sovereignty over security. Freedom over comfort. Truth over belonging. One person at a time. Until the critical mass shifts and the old system collapses under its own weight. Let me be direct about something. This video is not going to solve your problems. Understanding Father Geronimo's story doesn't make you immune to manipulation. Seeing the pattern doesn't automatically free you from it. Knowledge is not liberation. It's just the beginning of a process. The actual work is daily. It's examining every certainty, questioning every emotional reaction, noticing when you're being positioned, recognizing when you're trying to position others, building your capacity to sit with uncertainty, to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to change your mind without losing your sense of self. This work is uncomfortable. It's easier to be certain, easier to pick a side and defend it, easier to consume content that confirms what you already believe, easier to stay inside the narrative frameworks you've inherited. The system is designed to make sovereignty uncomfortable and compliance easy. That's not accident. That's the entire point. So if you leave this video and immediately slot these ideas into your existing worldview without letting them challenge anything, if you use this information to feel superior to people still caught in the system, if you share this to prove how aware you are, you've missed the point entirely. You've just made Father Geronimo's story another narrative to be captured by. The measure of whether this landed isn't what you believe afterward. It's what you question. It's whether you slow down before reacting. Whether you notice the next time emotional manipulation is attempted. Whether you catch yourself trying to manipulate others. Whether you can hold your beliefs more lightly. Whether you can engage with people you disagree with as full human beings rather than as representatives of enemy narratives. Whether you can build something real in your life instead of just consuming content about what's wrong. These are the markers of actual integration, of information becoming wisdom. And they're not dramatic. They're not viral. They don't make good stories. They're just the slow, unglamorous work of becoming a man who owns his own consciousness, who can't be moved by propaganda because he's rooted in something deeper than narrative, who can participate in the world without being captured by its systems, who can hold power without being corrupted by it because he knows power is just a story we agree to believe. This is what Father Geronimo never understood. What every authoritarian throughout history has failed to grasp. Consciousness cannot ultimately be controlled. Only consciousness that's forgotten itself can be controlled. The moment you remember, the moment you wake up, the game is over. They can still harm you, but they can't own you. Not anymore. So here's where we end. Christmas Eve, 1828. A young woman screaming in a plaza while 3,000 people call it holy. A friar drunk on power he's convinced himself is righteousness. A system that protects the abuser and forgets the victim. And one man, Diego Sepulveda, walking away. That image is everything. The screaming is the world as it is. The power structure as it operates. The manipulation visible and invisible. The complicity we all carry. But the walking away, that's the possibility. That's the choice that's always available even when it seems impossible. Especially when it seems impossible. You can't save Maria Elena. She died almost 200 years ago. You can't stop Father Geronimo. He's dust. But you can be Diego. You can recognize the moment when staying becomes participation in something that violates your core. And you can walk. Not in anger. Not in righteousness. Just in quiet recognition that this isn't yours. That you won't be a character in someone else's story anymore. That you're going to build something different, even if it's small, even if it's imperfect, even if it doesn't last. Because the attempt is everything. The example is everything. And somewhere, someone watching you walk away will find the courage to follow. That's how the pattern breaks. That's how the spell ends. One person at a time, remembering they're free. Comment, I see the pattern, one more time if you made it this far. Then go build something real.